Welcome. Welcome to our Focus Forum. If you don't know, I'm Rita Riker, President of the Board of Focus Greater Syracuse, and I'm really delighted to have you with us today. Our topic today is a hot topic, Assessment 101, a primer on housing and property assessment. We have three very knowledgeable panelists who will speak on the topic, and they'll be formally introduced in just a moment. As usual, we're scheduled for 1 hour, and we are recording this session. After being introduced, our panelists will each make a brief presentation, and then we'll follow those presentations with some Q&A. We'll begin the Q&A with the questions we received ahead of time. Thank you for those who did submit questions ahead of time. And if you have a question and have not yet submitted it, you can also place the question in the chat, and we'll get to as many of those questions as time permits. Now, I'm very pleased to turn this over to our moderator, Don Radke. Don is a member of the Focus Board and immediate past president of the board. More to the point for this forum, Don is a real estate broker and director of FM Realty Group. So he's steeped in the information on assessments as well. Don will introduce our panelists. Don.
Thank you so much, Rita, and it's a pleasure to be here. Our first panelist is Donald Weber, and he's Director of Property Tax Services. Don has been Director of the Real Property Tax Services of Onondaga County since 2012. He came to this position from the New York State Department of Taxation, the Finance Office of Real Property Tax Services, where he worked from 2005 to 2012, assisting and overseeing municipal reassessment projects throughout Central New York. He is the current president of the New York State Association of Directors of Real Property Tax Services and a member of the Onondaga County Agricultural Farmland Protection Board. His office is responsible for apportioning and establishing county tax rates, preparation of tax bills for county, towns, schools, and villages, the collection and enforcement of delinquent property tax revenue, the preparation and maintenance of tax maps, and assisting, advising, and training local governments to effectively administer tax collection and assessment functions. And in his spare time, he's with us. Thank you so much, Don. It's yours.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I guess I've been asked to give a brief overview of the assessment process, how it works, at least in our neck of the woods here in New York. Generally, everything works the same across most of New York State outside of New York City. So I'll stick to that, to the basics. Property assessment in New York State is all governed by New York State law. So even though every town has their own assessor, they're all trying to follow the same sets of rules, that have been established by the state. It's a local function. So every town, all 1,100 of them, is going to have an assessor and or city. We also have the city of Syracuse here in Onondaga County. And that's who's doing the assessing. It's all done at the local level. So we have 19 towns in the county. We have 19 individual assessors, plus the city of Syracuse. Even though the assessor is responsible for assessing all the property in the town, the state of New York also plays a role as well. The assessor is responsible for assessing individual properties within the town, but the state is responsible for establishing full market values of towns as a whole. So in essence, they act as the assessor for the towns. They'll come in and say, well, the city of Syracuse is worth $4.8 billion. That's the assessment for the city of Syracuse. They make up 17% of the total of Onondaga County, and they're going to be responsible for 17% of the county tax levy. So the state does play a role in this. That's where some of the confusion comes in, I think, from local property owners and even some assessment professionals. Don't really realize the state, what a significant role the state plays in local assessment. It is the assessor's responsibility to establish equity within the town, but it's the state's responsibility to establish equity amongst the towns, right? Not because assessing is a local function, the state mandates, or the Real Property Tax Law 305 says that local governments, the assessors, they don't necessarily have to assess property at 100% of its market value, but they have to establish a uniform percent of value. So every property within a town, the assessor has to assess at the same percentage of its full market value, but not necessarily at 100%, right? And we see this in our towns. People, I'm sure, look at their tax bill if you live in the town of Clay and you live in a house that is worth $200,000, your house is only assessed at around $7,000 or $8,000, right? Your assessment is $7,000, but obviously your house is worth a lot more than $7,000, right? The assessor is not mandated to assess all property 100%. And in most cases, this isn't done purposely. I mean, it is and it isn't. The assessor doesn't come through and just decide from year to year, oh, I think we're going to be at 10% this year. Now I think we're going to be at 3% next year. In reality, what happens is these assessments were established many, many years ago and then left alone. So the only time an assessment would be changed is when somebody, puts an addition on a house, demolishes an improvement, they pull a building permit for some reason, or if the assessor sees that, hey, there's some really wild inequities in the roll here, and I think some adjustment is necessary, right? So if they're not updating the assessments from year to year, you will start to see inequities between towns, which is why the state has to come in and say, well, I'm looking at, I'm going to keep picking on the town of Clay because their rate is very low. Your assessments, and we think you're at 4% this year, and then they'll come in next year and say, oh, well, based on, how hot the real estate market has been, there's been a lot of appreciation. We think you're at 3.8% this year. And that's what's called the equalization rate. You take that rate and divide it by the total assessed value of the town, and that gives you the full market value. That's what helps apportion taxes across the county. It's most important for county taxes because everybody in the county pays county taxes. And because you have wildly different assessments, potentially in, say, Clay and Cicero, two neighboring towns, one assesses at almost 4% and one is closer to 100, you have to have different tax rates. So the equalization rate helps to establish those differing tax rates so that properties that are worth about the same amount pay the same amount in taxes, even though their assessments are wildly different. And that's kind of, that's the 30,000 foot high level overview of how assessments work, without getting into the weeds on individual assessments or anything like that. I don't know if.
Okay, thank you so much, Don, and I'm sure the questions will be rolling in. Our next presenter is also a board member of Focus Greater Syracuse, but since 2020, Matt OJ has served the public in the City of Syracuse Department of Assessment. He provides leadership and strategic direction in the department that is responsible for both development and implementation of the city's real property valuation strategy and general oversight of the city's real estate portfolio. Among other responsibilities, this entails ongoing assessment of almost 42,000 parcels within the City of Syracuse in accordance with New York State law and market trends. Matt, you're on.
Thank you, Don. I'm thrilled to be here talking about everybody's favorite assessment, topic of assessment, which we may have noticed is in the news periodically, especially our City of Syracuse, which to jump off Don's point about Don Weber's point about the equalization rate is something that's getting some attention. With a hot market, our equalization rate keeps sliding, and that does not change our overarching goal, which is to prevent inequities within the role itself. But it certainly does highlight the differences between our existing assessments of approximately 30,000 residential properties and a market that really has made unprecedented leaps across every ward in our city for 3 years, but especially since the pandemic lockdowns began. I think we've had a perfect storm of a bit of money in the economy, low interest rates, and people with a strong desire and means to invest in real property, housing supply has not kept pace with demand. And so we've really seen an overheated housing market that shows few signs of abating. At the same time, the resources the city has been able to expend on residential assessment and assessment overall have not changed. We are intending to do more with less, or at least more with the same. And it's been interesting where the rubber meets the road to see just what the challenges are. Again, obviously, equity is the name of the game. We have a data-driven approach to citywide assessment every year. This past year, we made more changes to assessments than we had in any year since the 1994 reval. I believe 4,486 changes was our final total of about 30,000, 31,000 residential properties in the city. That might seem like the proverbial drop in the ocean, but we are targeting neighborhoods where we've seen the most appreciation and where the delta between the current assessed values is greatest from full market. We've got an interesting system here that deviates a little bit from the towns, which I know Warren is going to talk about more in depth later. Our assessment year is different than the bulk of the municipalities in the state. Our taxable status date is January 1st. That's when we release the tentative roll and go into the grievance period, 2 weeks of filing. Rather than having a grievance day, as many towns do, we have a grievance period where we schedule hundreds of appointments for people to come in at a set time and grieve before the 5-person independent board of assessment review. That's during the month of February. That leaves us a month to process remaining loose ends and get the roll finalized on or around the 31st of March. We then have a good chunk of the year devoted to field work. That would be getting out into the neighborhoods with our 3 full-time neighborhood assessors and a couple other staffers in the department who work on assessment. And we spend approximately 6 months in the neighborhoods, weighing market data, taking physical inventory, and then ultimately making assessment changes or not, as each case deserves, in advance of the following tax status date of January 1st the next year. These, of course, make up the foundation of our system of property taxation. The mill rate is what we pull that taxation out of based on the assessment of real property. Again, the equalization rate slides each year, it seems. We are at 69% this year. That is, if one has an assessment as judged by our department to be $69,000, that would equate to a full market value of $100,000. Ought to be borne out by sales prices. Sales comparison approach is generally what we use, certainly for residential properties, going out and bracketing a sale of a house in a neighborhood based on similar sales in that same neighborhood. Ideally, there are some neighborhoods in the city where, in spite of an appreciating market, there aren't too many data points out there. But of all the 19 wards in the city in the last 3 years, we have seen a lot of sales activity. And going forward, we, shall we say, we're looking to innovate. There have been leaps and bounds made, and obviously Warren can speak to this a little more in the towns perhaps, but there are certain municipalities that really do use trending or modeling for residential property valuation. The city of Syracuse has yet to delve into that. Again, ours is an extraordinarily diverse city, great diversity in housing stock, great differences among neighborhoods. So what we do is almost more art than science, and getting a computer to reflect that seems easier said than done. And it doesn't seem easy to say either. But going forward, we recognize that short of a full citywide reval, 4 or 5, even 6,000 changes a year puts us on a cycle of just not getting to where we want to be. We've been able to minimize to the greatest extent possible, I think, inequities within the role. But as far as getting to 100% of full market, the current system just can't get us there. And, look forward to fielding questions at the tail end of this, but that is where we are right now.
Okay, thank you so much, Matt, and I'm sure questions will be coming. Our next presenter is Warren Wheeler. He's a member of the Institute of Assessing Officers and Executive Director of the New York State Assessors Association. Warren was appointed as Executive Director of the New York State Assessors Association in December of 2018, shortly after completing his term as president in the 2017-2018. He has been an assessor since 2000 for the towns of Amboy, Constantia, Moneta, Richland. I think he's a glutton for punishment. His prior experience was with major revaluation contractors and as a case manager with a law firm specializing in property tax litigation. He earned his Institute of Assessing Officers designation in 2004, completed instructor training in 2005, and received his certified residential appraisal license in 2008. Warren, you're on.
Thanks, Don. Thanks, everybody. Glad to be here. Appreciate the invite. So as Don said, I am the executive director of the New York State Assessors Association, as well as an assessor for just 4 towns now. So my punishment is definitely at a minimum now than it was a few years ago. So I kind of wanted to talk about, there's always this big misunderstanding when it comes to value, assessments, taxes, an assessor, right? And I think someone mentioned it earlier. There's a appraised value and assessed value, market value. All these terms are kind of used interchangeably. And Don kind of touched a little bit about how the state comes in and values the town, but the assessor values the individual properties that come up with the sum of the town. So some of the things that are interesting, at least to me, that I think where people tend to not fully understand is that assessors are basically looking at the participants in the marketplace and just sitting back. We're just watching, right? We're not really, we have no real control over what the market does. We have no control over value. We just sit back, we look at it, and we say, okay, this is what's happening as far as residential goes. This is what's happening with, lakefront, or this is what's happening with vacant land. There's no correlation between, the assessor doesn't really have any control over taxes. And it's a loaded question too, okay? Because we're not tax assessors, but we do ultimately have a stake in what an individual will pay as far as their taxes go. In other words, the municipalities, whether it's the town or the village or the county or the school, they have what we refer to as a levy, the amount of money that they need to operate. That is what I refer to as the pie. The pie is the pie, right? They make it, they bake it, whatever. The assessor now will actually divvy out that pie based on the individual assessments for a municipality, for the town, okay? And if you challenge your assessment, or if you get an exemption, or if the assessor raises your assessment, right, your pie slice is being altered, and therefore, your taxes are being altered. In what way? Okay, whether they're being increased or decreased. But we talked about the equalization rate, and we talked about the uniform percent of value, and that you don't have to assess at 100%, but you do have to declare a level of value and your uniform percentage. So when you see these towns, and I think it was Don who mentioned it earlier too, that because we use Clay, I think is probably one of the few towns that has an EQ rate that's so low, that 4%, 3.5%, whatever it is. When you see your EQ rate, so a town in 2021 does a revaluation and they get certified by the state of New York, they're at 100%. And if they don't do anything for 2022, you could see an EQ rate, maybe 85%. And when you look at something like that, that means that the market is appreciating and the assessments are not reflecting that appreciation. So many years ago, it wasn't unusual to see EQ rates above 100. And I don't remember exactly when, but the state capped it off eventually. But I do recall early on in my career seeing a few towns in my immediate area where the equalization rate was over 100. And so in that instance, basically, they're saying that, towns were kind of overvaluing, their town. So it's interesting. But when you see the EQ rate drop below 100, it's usually indicative that your market is appreciating and the assessments are not keeping pace. So with that, the other issue that people don't fully understand, and I completely understand why they don't understand it, because I live for today, as most of us do, right? So when it's time for people to get their tax bill and they see that, maybe their assessment is, they feel that the assessment's too high or whatever, what they don't realize is this is a snapshot in time. And so the standard assessment calendar for the vast majority of municipalities in the town is a taxable status date of March 1 and a valuation date of the previous July 1. So let's just talk about the 2022 assessment roll. Taxable status date was March 1st of this year. And then the valuation date was July of last year. And we were analyzing the sales that occurred from June 2020 to July 2021. All right. So our assessment rolls come out. The final roll comes out in a week for the vast majority of us. Grievance days are over. And so the value that we're putting on there is a reflection of the market from a year ago. All right. And a lot of people have a hard time with that, especially in an appreciating market. And now if that market seems to be cooling off, we're not gonna know right away. It's going to take time before it actually is reflected in the assessment cycle. So we would have to fast forward another year, right? Go to June of 2023 and see what that last year of sales does to see what's happening in the market, and then how that translates to the assessment. But the biggest reason, it's a time consuming, it's a financial burden to do to maintain the assessments at 100%. It's not as easy as pushing a button and letting the computer do it, because the computer, even the best computer models, you still need to put eyes on it, right? I mean, you really need the human focus. It's a challenge. It's not mandated by the state. I don't see it being mandated by the state because it costs so much money. You're looking at, I don't know what it would cost the city of Syracuse if they couldn't do it in-house. I would imagine it's got to be several $100,000 to do a reval in the city of Syracuse with 30 some odd thousand properties. And it's difficult because it's not like buying solar panels, and saying that after 7 years, I'm going to start getting my money back. The city of Syracuse could have done a reval in 2021, and with this market would have been, they would have had 100% for 1 year. And then they could have been, if they weren't able to maintain it, they would have been below 100 again the very next year because of the rapid changes in the market. So it is a very interesting profession. It's one where my job has become more of a customer service rep, where I'm explaining the process a lot more because people just don't understand it, right? And almost always, right, after I sit down and talk to somebody, where they may not like it, all right, because I'm in it. Most of us are in it, right? If you own property and real estate, we're in it. And none of us really care for the whole tax system, but once we understand it and they know what the rules are, they feel a lot better. And then they realize that, okay, I'm not being singled out. I understand why my assessment's being changed. And then, here's what you do if you feel that your property isn't worth that. And so I could take 3 hours. And so because I have a tendency to do that. So I think I covered everything that I wanted to touch base on, and looking forward to any type of questions that may come up.
Warren, thank you so very much. Now I'd like to turn the forum over to our esteemed board member, Brian Hoke, to help us manage and ask questions. Brian, you're on.
Thanks, Don. And thanks to all the panelists and everybody joining us here today. As Rita mentioned, we received a bunch of questions in advance. If you have questions that come up, I see a few popping up already. We'll try to get to those, but we'll put them to the panelists. Don Radke, please feel free to jump in with your expertise as well. A lot of the questions, perhaps unsurprisingly, were about how do I do this, right? How does the grieving process work? How do I ask for changes, presumably to the, I'm assuming most people are not altruistically asking to pay more tax, but if, if folks want to, certainly we had a few questions about that. So would appreciate hearing from the panel your thoughts about how folks can address that.
Sure. I mean, like, listen, that is the number one question, right? And I always like to use the analogy, gas right now is $6 a gallon or $5 a gallon, whatever. I can't go to the pump and say, you know what, this is too much. I'm going to go in and I'm going to talk to the owner of this station and I'm going to say, you know what, I don't think this is right and I want a reduction. It doesn't work that way. But guess what? With assessments, it's absolutely works that way. And so I would implore everybody to start with the local assessor. Have that conversation. You've got to go in with, you can start with an information gathering. How did you come up with this? If you're in a municipality that's not at 100%, there's a pretty good chance that assessment could be, several years old. Okay. And maybe it's not a true representation of what your property's value is. So go in, have the conversation. Eventually, you're going to have a conversation with yourself, and an honest conversation with yourself. Can I sell my property for this? Okay. That is the loaded question. And let's be honest, we don't know what you can sell your property for until we go to sell your property. There's no given definitive answer that says, X amount for this, and that's the end of it, right? If that was the case, anybody could do this job. So if you feel that you're truly overvalued, okay, you have that conversation with the assessor. There's an exchange of information. Here's how the assessor came up with the value. Here's what you think as the property owner it is. Maybe you come to an agreement. Okay, you don't come to an agreement, that's fine. You still have another level of recourse. It's called grievance day. I don't really care for the name, but that's what it is. We air out our grievances on that day. Standard grievance day across the state is the 4th Tuesday of May. We just had it. Cities are usually different, but find out when your grievance day is in your municipality, and you make an appointment, or there's paperwork to fill out. But then it's an informal process, usually made up of 3 to 5 members, usually residents of the town, hopefully with some sort of understanding of, some sort of real estate knowledge or background, but not always, and then the assessor would say, this is why I feel Mr. Smith's property is worth $100,000. Mr. Smith comes in and says, this is why we feel it's not worth $100,000, whether you have an appraisal, whether it's a recent sale, or whether you've gone and located some properties that you feel are comparable to yours and have a much lower assessment. Then they make their determination, they notify you by mail. If you're still not satisfied, you have one more level. Usually for residential properties, you would go small claims. Commercial properties go a different route. It's called Article 7 or 78. It's a much more expensive process to go Article 78. Small claims is still pretty informal. I think it's $30 or $35. I always get it confused, but you don't need an attorney, but it is a little bit more formalized. You have to do this, this, and this. Assessors don't usually offer advice on small claims for fear of, if I tell you this is what you need to do and you don't follow through, you come back and say, well, that's not what you told me to do. It gets to be a sticky situation. So typically assessors will say, you need to figure out the small claims on your own. Here's the form, and that's the end of it. And then you get a court-appointed hearing officer, and it would be pretty much the same thing, except you're pleading your case to one individual, why you feel it's not worth it. The assessor will go in and say why they feel it is worth it, and then the person makes their decision and notifies you by mail.
Gotcha. All right.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, and I'll restate that
Yeah, please.
whether it's town of Amboy or the city of Syracuse, if you come in August and say you'd like eyes on your property, on your house, we'll get a human being there fast. We are happy to conduct these informal reviews of assessments anytime anyone asks, and perhaps that's not as publicized as it could be, but it happens a lot, and it often works out in the would-be grievance favor.
But, I think I'd like to point out too, something that I hear a lot from property owners, and I think maybe people don't realize nowadays with computers, everybody thinks, you know, you can make a change like this, but the real property tax law is taxes are an old beast, right? Been around a long time. The way the law is written, the assessor is filing one single assessment roll a year. So when we're throwing all these terms around about taxable status date and the assessment roll is literally a pile of paper. Like it is of course computerized nowadays, but all these laws were written with paper in mind. So the assessor establishes one assessment for every property in town annually. And they do that, and I'm going to use the towns because that applies to the majority of the state. Of course, Matt, the city is a little bit different. But March 1st is what we call taxable status date. The assessor is going to value what's physically there on March 1st, right? So if there's a house there on March 1st, it's getting a value. If the house burns down on March 2nd, you're still getting assessed for a full house, right? The assessor is going to file that roll, their tentative assessment roll, that's the legal term for it, on May 1st. Once they do that, they can no longer legally make any changes to the roll. They can't, even if they see a mistake that they made, or not necessarily, not an error, but you know, something they wish they could change, they can't change it. On the fourth Tuesday in May, there's an appointed body in each town called the Board of Assessment Review. Those are the only people that can make changes to the assessment roll between the time that it's tentative and the time that it's final. And the property owner has one single day every year to go in and ask for a formal change to their assessment. That's grievance day. You go and you sit before the Board of Assessment Review and you argue your case to them, and the assessor argues his or her case to them. And this grievance board will make a decision. They'll either lower it or they won't. And whatever they decide on July 1, that roll becomes final. Will not change unless the court orders a change, whether that's sworn and described through the small claims process or through an actual court reduction. And that assessment is going to be used then for your September school bill, your January town and county bill, and then the following, if you live in the village, the following June. So almost a year later. So if your house burnt down on March 2nd, you're going to get a tax bill the following June potentially that shows you're being taxed for a house still, right? That's how this process works. It's very, even though if you came in, you got your school tax bill in September, October, and you say, holy smokes, I'm over assessed. I'm going to go in and talk to Warren about this. And you go in, Warren, what are you doing to me? You got to lower this. And Warren's like, oh man, you're right. We got to do something about this. He can't change it until the next assessment roll comes out. So it's not like you go in and talk to your assessor, and even if they agree, they're not going to lower it right then and there. It doesn't happen like that. It's a very static process.
Is it ever the case? I'm sorry, did I cut you off, Don?
No, I was just going to say, I don't think a lot of property owners realize that.
Yeah, no, that's great to know. Is it ever the case that during this process, the homeowner who comes in to challenge an assessment highlights to the folks doing the assessment, oh, indeed, it is wrong. And in fact, it's much higher than we had thought. You said it's either lowered or kept the same. I presume it's never increased, correct?
The board review,
yeah, I mean, go ahead, Don.
They can only decrease it.
Okay.
So if you're going to go to grievance, the Board of Assessment Review can lower it to what you asked for or something in between, but they can't raise it ever.
Got it.
The
That's good.
assessor could raise it the following year, which, you know,
But not based on my challenge.
No.
Okay. Sorry, Warren, did you want to come in on that? Did you have a?
No, I was just gonna say, like I said, I've been doing this for 20+ years, and I've been asked 5 times in my career, or suggested 5 times in my career, that their assessment wasn't high enough. So it does happen, but it's a very rare occurrence. It's just not something you see every day. It's mostly the other day. But you know, and Don brings up a good point. It's only the 1 day a year, but I think Matt was alluding to the fact that you don't have to wait for that whole, you know, that 1 day. We're welcome. A lot of the assessors are willing to have those conversations ahead of time. Unfortunately, because of the law, it will take some time, but you don't need to, because I do, even to this day, I still deal with people who thought that they had to wait until May before they could come in and talk to me. I'm like, no, you can talk to me anytime you want. But if you talk to me on May 2nd, it's going to be a long time, you know, potentially before it could change if you don't do the, you know, go through grievance.
Warren, may I ask what the reason might be behind somebody asking? Does it contribute to a higher sale price, perhaps, if somebody's asking for a higher?
Yeah, that's what it was. The last few times I've been asked, you know, they were looking to sell, and there's a big, you know, there's a lot of people who feel that if I'm going to sell my property, I want my assessment high to get the most money that I can for it. And, you know, I keep trying to explain to everybody, I'm sure most of the realtors on this call realize it already. Like, while there should be a relationship between the assessment and the market value, you know, we're doing mass appraisal. And so there's a big difference between, you know, a house in general and then what an appraiser would do, or like a realtor would, you know, you're going through that house top to bottom. The assessor's not doing that, right? The assessor's basically looking at it from the road. And then there are instances when, you know, there's things that have been done, whether permitted or not permitted, and don't reflect in the assessment records. And so it's not uncommon for a house to command more money in the market than the assessment records reflect. So.
Gotcha. Has technology changed this process, the use of drones or satellite imagery? And hey, we see there's a pool there you didn't mention. I mean, has that changed?
Well, it certainly has. It certainly has for me. I don't know. I don't know what technological advances Matt's using in the city of Syracuse, but I would imagine it is. I mean, we have what we in Oswego County has pictometry, which is the aerial photography, and it can actually run from one flyover to the next and actually show you what properties actually had a physical change. And then you can go and look at that and see, is it matching up? Then, you know, did they get a building permit or not? And so, yeah, technology certainly helped. But unfortunately, some of my towns, the aerial photography is the same from year to year, just a bunch of trees. You know, they're very rural and not much to see except pine trees.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and we did just get word that Pictometry's most recent flyover, which I think was spring of 21, won't be repeated again for 2 or 3 more years, which is surprising. But the city is fortunate. We just, in conjunction with the Department of Public Works, are in the process of signing a contract with Cyclomedia, which provides, I guess the best way to put it would be Google Street View on steroids. Really, really very high fidelity pictures generated by a drive-through by their staff of every street, public or private, in the city. So good that one can take measurements from the screen. Should save people a bit of time in the field. Again, there's no substitute for getting a real human being out there to lay eyes on a property and appreciate the context of it. And I don't mean from behind a windshield, I do mean walking the sidewalks. But if there's a question of, has an addition gone up? Was there a porch demolition in recent months? That's a tremendous time savings in terms of getting our physical inventory exactly where it needs to be, which, as one can imagine, with about 42,000 total parcels, is an hour-to-hour challenge.
A lot of boots on the ground. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. We did have folks ask some questions about sort of tactical approaches to this. Is a Zillow listing relevant data in arguing one's case for presumably a lower assessment? Any other thoughts there about, I mean, some of you touched on it in your opening remarks, but welcome any thoughts you have for folks who are, either going through or planning to go through sometime down the road this process.
I think that's probably a good starting point for a property owner. I don't think you could rely solely on that, only because nobody knows where those numbers come from. Like
Right.
that is a proprietary algorithm that they've come up with. If you want to look on there, I think there are sale prices, you can find comparable properties. The county hosts a lot of information on our website now you can look just about any property up in the whole county, see sales, comparable assessments. But for a tool like Zillow, it's like anything, take it with a grain of salt, but I wouldn't bring it into your assessor and expect to get lowered solely on that alone, because we don't know where they're pulling their data from and we don't know what they're doing with it. So.
Gotcha. Thanks. Anybody else want to come in on that? Can I move on to another?
Yeah, I agree. It's a data point. I think Zillow is probably more useful for, as Don alluded to, just looking at the margin and seeing sales in the neighborhood and attempting to create a small universe of possible comps on one's own. I'd love to get a look at their algorithm, but we can't, and so I wouldn't vouch for it. It seems pretty ambitious in most cases.
Gotcha. Okay. We had a question. Nancy actually posed a question. Do you know how the process in New York State and the rates in New York State and the legalities surrounding it compare to other states? Are there vast differences in the United States between and among how individual states handle this, New York in particular? I mean, not that any of you should, because obviously all you work here.
Pennsylvania is noteworthy in that some municipalities in Pennsylvania have adopted a land tax, which is intended to remove what in many areas is a perverse disincentive to not improve one's property. But we assess the improvements when, in theory, the real value is in the location. That is not permissible in New York State. The jury is out as to how effective that is as a tool to build equity and to encourage economic development. But when I'm asked that question, that's always one that comes quickly to mind, because it has its real adamant supporters.
I can think of two examples. One, my parents now live in Florida, and they have countywide assessing down there. They don't do it at the local level. One of our local assessors actually came to us from Florida and was very surprised at how we do things in New York. So,
Shocked.
Yeah. So, much bigger assessing units down there, much larger office rather than, in the town of Geddes, which is, I think, in the neighborhood of 10,000 parcels. You have one assessor and one, part-time clerk. The town of Clay, it's got 20,000 parcels, maybe 3 full-time employees, not a big staff for doing what's a pretty big job. You know what I mean? Then there are other states that kind of encourage behavior that we discourage. I think one of the questions I saw ahead of time was about something called welcome stranger.
Right. Thank you for bringing that up.
Right, being assessed based on the purchase price of a property. In New York State, that's illegal, although there are no assessment police. But in states like, I believe, California, that's encouraged. You get reassessed based solely on the resale value of the property. So states are kind of all over the place with this.
And Don, may I ask, what's the reasoning behind New York discouraging that? Is that there's such a variation based on perhaps not relevant or reasonable sort of expectations?
It creates inequities, essentially. So think about you and your neighbor, an identical house, you're in a subdivision, and you both bought 20 years ago, and your assessment hasn't changed in 20 years. And the full market value, because the equalization rate has gone down over the years, is now $250,000.
Mm-hmm.
Well, your neighbor sells his house, and the new guy comes in and pays $350,000. So he's now got the identical house, same house that you have right next door, and he's paying a third more in taxes because you reassessed and you have it. So you can't, in New York, can't pick on anybody. You can't reassess a property solely because it's sold. We do have still many towns that do annual reassessment. They try to keep their assessments at 100%.
Mm-hmm.
You're looking at the entire assessment roll and you're analyzing the assessment roll. the entire roll, then you can raise the assessments of properties that's sold because it's appropriate for them to be increased. You've looked at the roll and said they need to go up. These ones do. This neighborhood needs to go up. This one needs to go down. You know, so on and so forth.
Gotcha. Anybody else want to come in on that?
And I think California used to do that, and they found that it was discouraging people from actually selling the property, and then you weren't getting the turnover. And then I thought this was probably 15 or 20 years ago. They were like almost bankrupt because they weren't getting, they were spending way more money than they were able to get in. Because I think there was also a limit as to how much they could actually raise the taxes from year to year. So it's the biggest thing around here is that it's just it creates inequity, which is basically the one thing that we really strive in a system that is as archaic and as old as the day is long to achieve.
Gotcha. Thank you. We have a question from the press, Michelle. Hey, Michelle. Thanks for your question. What would you like the state to change about assessments or exemptions? She posed the example, should the senior exemption be uniform across towns? But, you know, if you all could wave a magic wand and make not only your jobs, but the sort of cause for which you work better, what might that look like?
Well, there's a big win that I'll steal Warren's thunder and celebrate. The condo loophole has been closed. I believe it's still awaiting the governor's signature. But this is something that I know the city has lobbied for a long
Matt, would you,
time.
for those of us who aren't as familiar, would you share just a brief overview of what that is?
So properties that are legally organized as a condominium regime, whether or not they take what we consider to be the traditional form of a condo, that is, you know, an ownership apartment essentially, or a large suburban house, pay a fraction of full market due to statutory restriction on how they are valued, and have since the 70s. This was enacted, stabilizing the housing market in New York City, but in upstate, it is perceived, perhaps rightly, as just being a giveaway to condo owners, at the expense, naturally, with the different slices of pie of all of their neighbors in the municipality. So when Governor Hochul signs this, as is anticipated, we'll be able to bring those assessments up to par, and I think that'll again further our goal of reducing inequities in the roll.
Cool.
A lot of the outrage over that one has to do with large homes, or what some assessors call McMansions, that are classified as condominiums. Condominium is a type of ownership. It's not a type of building. A lot of people hear condominium, they think of an apartment, you know, apartment unit in a building, right? But the problem really exists with these very large homes being classified as condominiums and not paying their fair share of taxes.
Gotcha. We're getting close to time, but if I may, I'll ask one more question from my fellow board member, Bob. He asked, how might assessment policies support increases in property values? I wonder how the policies themselves might be structured to, you know, work towards the general good of improving a community, improving individual property values. Just thoughts on how that policy might, how those policies might be used as a tool. Any last thoughts on that?
That's a great question. That's a panel discussion in and of itself, I think, Bob. You know, an example comes to mind, a little inside baseball here. This is a commercial property that we were authorized to create a partial tax exemption for. That is a shelter rent agreement, which is organized under the New York State private housing finance law to incentivize the construction of affordable housing throughout the state. A laudable goal for a number of reasons, including economic development. And this particular project was to have a mixed use component, which under the law isn't permissible. So this was working at cross purposes with exactly what we want to do. And we found a workaround, and were able to enable this commercial space to coexist with the larger affordable residential project. But tweaking those sorts of laws and regulations all while understanding that we have a sort of a discrete focus task of assessment administration, being fair and equitable, while also recognizing the context of the world around us is really important.
It's well said. Thank you. Anybody else want to come in for a last comment? Warren?
Yeah, I don't know that the way this current system is structured that we could, and Matt's right. This is definitely something that should be discussed at length outside this, because this system is based on perceived value, right? And there's a lot of people who have made it a point to, mention to me that I keep my property up, therefore I'm being penalized. And honestly, they're not really being penalized, but they're kind of being penalized, right? I mean, if you take pride in your property and you keep it up, you maintain it. The notion is that when you go to sell it, you're going to be able to sell it for more than the one that's not doing the same thing. And then there could be many reasons why they're not keeping it up. Okay. Usually it's they're just not able to, and that sort of thing. So I don't know how we do it. That has been something that the association has been looking at, but I think it's going to be a radical change to the way things are currently and have been done in the past. And I don't have the answer, but I just know that the current system does not, in my opinion, do what we really want it to do and foster the growth that we would all want to achieve.
Gotcha. Well, thank you. Well, apologies for cutting off what is an interesting discussion, but thank you all for your comments. Very much enjoyed it. Rita, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. This is, wow, I've learned so much. I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but I've learned so much today. And I hope our audience has as well. So thank you so much, Warren, Donald, Matt, for being our panelists, Don Radke for being our moderator, and Brian for fielding the questions. I found it fascinating. So we'll be posting this forum on the Focus website because we have recorded it. So that should come in the next few days. It will be out there. If you know of somebody who could benefit from this conversation, please send them to our website, focussyracuse.org. And as a reminder, Focus is able to make these opportunities available with the financial support of the community. So you can easily make a donation, modest or otherwise, at our website, focussyracuse.org. Thanks so much to everybody. Have a great day. Have a great weekend.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.